What kind of insanity am I up to now? Well, let's see if we can take some construction lumber and make some furniture out of it. Stick around and we'll see how this turns out. Let me bring you up to speed real quick on a couple steps we've taken before we got here to the bandsaw. We've taken our 2x10 construction material over to the table saw and just kind of broken it down. We also did a couple glue ups to get the blanks ready for the top of the stool and also the legs. So I took a different approach to create the rough turning blanks for the legs. I want a 2x2 square that's 14 inches long to create the legs. Starting out with the construction lumber that's 1.5 inches thick, one option would have been to have ripped down 1/2 inch pieces, applied that to the 1.5 inches to create the 2 inches. What I did instead of that was I took my starting material and I ripped it 2 inches wide, flipped it, and glued many of the different widths, 1.5 inch widths together, almost creating like a cutting board. Once that was dry, then I cut those down into 2-inch segments, which did a couple things. First of all, it staggered my 1/2 inch seams on all of the different legs I was making. It also consolidated some of my glue ups, and since everything is going over to the lathe, ultimately I don't have to worry about how flat and square it is because it's going to be turned into round legs anyway. While we're working at the bandsaw, we'll go ahead and get a rough circle here on the top of the stool. This will just make it a little bit easier when we get over to the lathe. We want the top of the stool to finish out at a 10-inch diameter, so we're cutting this circle at 11 inches to give us a little room to get everything fitted and shaped down to that final 10-inch size. This first piece we're making at the lathe will eventually become a screw. This piece will get incorporated into each one of the legs, and that's how we're going to attach the stool legs to the stool top. So here we're just making a dowel effectively. It's going to be a 1-inch diameter dowel. In this first step, we're just roughing it down, getting the square corners off, trying to get this down about as quick as we possibly can. Here are a couple quick notes as we're working on roughing down this spindle. First, I'm using my 1-inch spindle gouge, just trying to get the corners off and get us down to round. The other thing is, while the rest of the stool is pine, these screws that we're creating here are made out of poplar. Over time, I've discovered that poplar is just a much better wood to create screws with, and you'll see more about that process a little bit later in the video. We've used the spindle roughing gouge to get pretty close to our diameter. Now I'm working from the tailstock end, and I've got a parting tool, and I'm using it just to get down to my 1-inch diameter. And once I have that diameter established down at the tailstock, I'll work that diameter all the way back down toward the headstock, and that'll give me a pretty consistent dowel. Now I've grabbed the spindle roughing gouge again, now that we know where that 1-inch mark is down on the end by the tailstock, and we're going to just remove a little bit more material before we start finishing this dowel. Now to sneak up on my final dimension for the dowel, I'm using my skew chisel, using my hand to kind of support the spindle. As it's getting thinner and thinner, it's starting to bounce a little bit, so I'm using my offhand to try to steady the workpiece a little bit. But I love using the skew chisel this operation. It's basically just a really light planing cut. I can take a really small amount and kind of work the diameter of the dowel right down where I want it, which is actually just below. I want to be a couple thousandths of an inch below the 1-inch mark I'm shooting for. It'll make the threading process go a lot easier later on. So I want to be just below 1 inch, and the skew chisel works great to help me get down there. I can take little bits off once I get super close, and it gives me a nice fine finish where maybe I need to sand, maybe I don't. The next step at the lathe is to start rough turning the legs. Now, our leg design is really a pretty straightforward, simple spindle design. What makes it a little more complicated and adds a few more steps to it is adding the screw at the end, which is going to be the joinery for our stool. As we move along through the build process, you'll kind of see what makes that a little more complicated, but at this step, all we're really looking to do is to get down to a rough 1.5 inch diameter dimension. The bulk of this work that we're doing here, we're using the 1-inch spindle gouge, much like we did with creating the 1-inch dowels for our screws. Here I'm using a shop-made jig. It's basically just a kind of like a shop-made caliper. It's got 1.5 inch diameter, and all I'm trying to do down here at the tailstock end with my parting tool is just kind of get down to that 1.5 inch dimension where I'm trying to rough down this piece before we pull it off the lathe and get ready for drilling operations. I use these shop-made kind of caliper jigs in a variety of sizes. I've got several different ones that I use, especially when I'm threading dowels. So I've got things like 1.5 inch, 1.25 inch, 1 inch, 3/4 inch, a lot of the common sizes that I'm also creating dowels for, kind of turning into screws later. So I use these quite a bit, and all I did was take a relatively thin piece of stock, drill a 1.5 inch hole in it with a Forstner bit. So I know I've got that 1.5 inch diameter, and then I just basically cut that hole in half, and that gives me an open end with a pretty perfect 1.5 inch measurement that works pretty well with these. Now we've got our rough down leg remounted into the lathe, and all we're going to do here is drill a 5/8 inch hole about 1.5 inches deep, and that's how we're going to attach the threads to the legs. So we need a little extra support down here on the tailstock end where we're drilling from, so that shop-made steady rest helps us accomplish that. So here's the first shot that we really have in the video so far of the handle for the stool. So far we've kind of been following the same process with the handles as we have with the legs. They're just much shorter. They're only about 8 inches long versus the 14-inch long legs at this point. With the legs and handles all roughed down and holes bored in the ends ready to receive the threads, now it's time to create the threads out of those poplar dowels we turned earlier. So here we're using the Beal Tool Company wood threader to create all of the threaded components for this project. This is one of my favorite tools in the shop. I'm really excited about it, and I did a full video kind of highlighting this process and this tool and the setup. So if you want to see how the threading process works in more detail, make sure you go check out that video. With our dowels threaded, now it's time to start breaking that threaded rod down into components that we can use and incorporate into the legs. So here I'm just marking out at I'm starting at the end at the tailstock. I want the thread to be about 1 inch long that protrudes out of the end of the leg, and then I want the shaft that gets glued into the leg about 1.5 inches long. So I've marked those components with a shop-made jig, and all I'm doing here is using my parting tool just to kind of trim away the threads where I don't need them. We're going to work that diameter down to 5/8 of an inch, which will match the holes that we drilled into the ends of each of the legs earlier. So here I'm using an open end wrench that's 5/8 of an inch, and this will help me size the shaft of the screw so it'll be right down at the exact size that we need for that glue up. And here are a couple pictures of gluing the screws into the legs. Now it's time to start working on the seat of the stool. Here we're using our coal jaws just to hold the seat on the lathe, and all we want to do is take a really fine shaving. All we're really trying to do is kind of flatten this bottom side of the stool. We have a glue joint here, and so we just want to smooth it out and make sure it's nice and flat. Once the bottom of the stool is nice and flat, we're going to create a really shallow recess or mortise. We'll use that recess to reverse mount the bowl in a different set of chuck jaws, and that's what we'll use to refine the final shape and size of the seat. Now we've got the stool flipped around, and it's time to work on the top. All we're doing here is trying to flatten the top, get it nice and smooth. We've got a glue joint we want to work out here. So I've got my bowl gouge, and I'm just using a shear scraping motion just to take just a little bit off. We don't really want to remove much material here, so I just want to flatten it very, very gently. Once the top of the stool is flat, I just want to take my compass here. I've got a large compass and I've got my 10-inch diameter marked out here. So from center, just kind of making a mark so we can get our final size. And now it's just working that edge down to get down to our final 10-inch diameter. Once we've got the final diameter position, the last thing to do is just put a gentle round over on each of the edges. So on the top edge and the bottom edge. Here I'm using my cutter tool to do this. This just seemed like the easiest way to do this, to be able to work on both the top and bottom, just kind of rotating around. Now we've got our stool tops over at the drill press where we're drilling the holes to receive the legs. So you can see here I do have a jig that is clamped down to the table on the drill press that's got my angle established. And then I've got marks on the jig as well so that I can align exactly where those 3 holes, kind of dividing that circle equally. The hole we're drilling is 7/8 of an inch. In our next step, we'll thread this hole, and then that's what will receive the 1-inch threads from the legs. While we're here at the drill press, we're also going to drill a hole for the handle. This is also a 7/8 inch hole, and it's important here that this hole is perpendicular to the grain, so we don't want to be drilling this hole into the end grain, so the alignment is very important. We are going to put tap threads into this hole just like we will on the bottom for the legs. So our 1-inch threads need to be cut here and they won't work in the end grain. So alignment here is actually pretty important. Now we're at the workbench where we're going to tap the female threads into the bottom of the stool. So here I'm using mineral oil just to kind of help lubricate the threading. I like to put the mineral oil kind of inside the hole and then also on the tap. And then from there we're just going to very gently screw the tap into that hole. What makes this a little bit tricky is getting this tap started because it's at an angle and the hole doesn't go all the way through. This tap is set up, it works very, very well when you've got a through hole where it goes all the way through, but it's a little tricky here when we've got an angled hole that does not go all the way through. When we get down to the bottom of the hole, the key here is to not, once it snugs up, you want to stop or else you'll strip out those threads. And when we're finished tapping the holes for the legs, we're going to reclamp the stool top so that we can thread the hole for the handle. We're back at the lathe to put the finishing touches on the legs. So I've got a story stick here where I'm marking the critical components. This is a relatively simple spindle design. With the simple design, we'll be able to do most of the work with the skew chisel. The first thing we'll do is to use a couple V-cuts right at those pencil lines. That'll help establish and mark top and bottom of the bead and also the bottom of the leg. Now we'll widen and make the V-cut deeper at the top and bottom of the bead. So we're going to use the V here. We're just going to cut a notch in, and that'll get down to the kind of the minor diameter or the smaller diameter of this bead we're going to establish here on the legs. Now that we're happy with the depth on the V-cuts, it's time just to shape from the top of the bead to the end of the leg where the screw is. So right there where that screw is, we want that diameter to be about 1 inch, and we just want a gradual kind of taper from 1.5 inches where the bead is down to 1 inch. So we're just going to work that down with the skew chisel, just kind of gradually getting down to that level. With the top of the leg shaped, we want to start working down toward the bottom. So here I've got my parting tool, and I'm just kind of going down to my depth for the bottom of the stool leg, which is also going to be 1 inch. Once we've got that established kind of in the waist portion there at the headstock, then we'll start working the bottom of the leg down from that 1.5 inches up by the bead down to tapering down to 1 inch at the bottom of the stool leg. I'm starting to pick up a little chatter as we're working this with the skew chisel, so I'm using my top hand just to kind of help steady the spindle as we shape down the bottom portion of the leg. With our tapers established on both the top of the stool leg and the bottom of the stool leg, now it's time to finish the bead in the middle. Our first step here is just a very slight round over from the top of the taper into the bead, and we'll do the same thing on the bottom here in a moment. And then all we want to do is establish the bead. In the center of the bead, I really don't want to move much material. I want to try to keep that 1.5 inch diameter right there in the middle and kind of taper from that point down into the valley of that V notch on both ends. Now all that's left on the legs is a quick sand just to smooth everything out. With the legs finished, it's time to turn our attention to the handle. So the handle is also a very simple shape. With the handle, all we have is a bead right out at the very end of the handle. It's going to be that 1.5 inch diameter, and then we're going to taper down to the screw that is also 1 inch on these handles as well. So we're going to do most of this with the skew chisel. Here we're just kind of creating our V notch. So we can have that slight round over, that slight bead detail at the end of the handle, and then we'll taper down to the screw. And we're finally down to the last couple steps in the process, which is finishing. So here we're just applying stain to the handles. We'll also use this natural stain on the stool seats themselves. We built a batch of stools here all together, all at one time, so some of the stool legs will be different colors. But I took some scrap, and kind of see here on the workbench, I used some scraps, went ahead and threaded holes just to hold all the different pieces while we're finishing. This made it pretty easy just to keep everything neat and allow it to dry, and just kind of helped aid the process quite a bit. The finish I'm using here is General Finishes gel stain. This color is called Prairie Wheat, which I found kind of takes pine and makes it very much a kind of a traditional red oak type color. The gel stain works pretty well. It does eliminate a lot of the blotching that you get out of pine and other kind of soft woods. It's really one of my favorite ways to add color to these types of projects. Once everything is colored, it's time for the final top coat. Like a lot of the bowls I've done recently, this is General Finishes High Performance, which is my favorite kind of spray finish. This is a water-based finish that I'm able to spray pretty effectively here in my basement with just kind of minimal exhaust running. Spraying this in a few light coats allows me to get 3 or 4 coats pretty quickly. I do kind of sand down and kind of knock down the finish in between each of the coats, and sanding in between each of the coats really produces a really great finish in the end.